Okay, so welcome to you all. Um, Let me put this up. And we should all be able to see this. This is just, we've got a couple of things. This is, this seminar is part of a series that we have put together this fall on outcomes assessment. And there's always a lot of question as to what outcomes are. Some people see it as projects, some people see it as testing, some people see it as lots of other things. And it can be just that. It can be lots of different things when you start talking about outcomes assessment. But part of it is, and a number of faculty, all of us, I think at some point, have relied on some type of an exam. And so the question is, how do we develop, or what type of testing can we use in our classes that will help to assess the outcomes of our students and what our students are learning? Because that's in essence what we're really looking to do here, is figure out, what do our students know? You know, we've spent a lot of time and effort, and if you think about it, the university spent a lot of money in developing curriculum that teaches students the things that we all know. And our students are coming to Robert Morris because of us. They're coming to learn and get the information that we know. So we're sharing our content with them. And we do that through all the teaching practices that we do, all the pedagogical practices, all the instructional design, all the things that we do, both online, on ground, combinations thereof, synchronously, asynchronously, hybrid approaches, all of that. But the question is, how do we know whether our students have learned anything? Sometimes we do that through projects, through performance assessments, through other things. Nicole did a whole session on rubrics and checklists. We can do that through universal assignments, but sometimes what we need is just a good old-fashioned exam to test and to see what our students have learned. And that is dependent upon a lot of things. Testing and exams are not for every course. They're not for every faculty. They're not for every item that we're trying to teach. But it is another tool that we can utilize, and it becomes our job to assess when we're going to use something and when something else may be a better option. So let's take a look at what test writing is and what it's all about and see what we can do. The goals of this session are really to describe the link between lesson or course objectives and writing exams, because that's the key. We can decide what we want to use as an assessment or an outcomes assessment tool based upon our own course objectives, our own lesson objectives, our program goals and objectives, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We're also going to go through and talk about the proper steps for developing multiple choice questions with STEM answers and distractors. Multiple choice questions are probably one of the most widely used type of exam questions, but they're not the only one. There are several others, and we're going to take a look at things like true, false, matching, fill in the blank, short answer, and essay type questions. The TSWBAT is the student will be able to. And this is a part of the objective writing, that if you put that as a prefix, then it just makes everything a little easier when you go through behavioral objective writing. We're also going to talk about when to employ true and false and matching and fill in the blank, short answer, essay, all the different exam questions, and help you as faculty to kind of make the choice in what is best going to meet your needs for outcomes assessment. One of the things that I can tell you, one of the things that you've probably seen as a thread through just about everything that we in the CIT talk about, is there is not a one-size-fits-all for anybody. This is all faculty dependent, and these are just options for you. And that's how we will look at it. There are some best practices, and we will try and share that with you as we kind of move forward. So let's take a look at, basically, there are two types of evaluation or assessment or outcomes measure. The first one is formative evaluation, which focuses on improving programs during the design and the teaching process. It's also looked at as during the formation of learning. And this is what we do when we're in the classroom, whether it's online, on ground, whatever it is. We are constantly reading our students. Are they getting the information? Sometimes that's through assignments that we give. Other times, homework assignments or short assignments. Other times it's us reading our students, seeing how they answer questions, seeing how they respond to certain things. We read body language, all kinds of things. Alicia's going to do a whole session and a seminar on formative assessment techniques that can be used. And they are part of outcomes, but they are also part of the teaching process. And in my mind, a very important part. The other thing that Dreshler talks about is summative evaluation, which is focusing on measuring student results at the end of a particular lesson or body of things. Now, the question always comes in, which is more important, formative assessment or summative assessment? And it's really just a trick question because they're both important. One does not replace the other. Formative evaluation happens during the formation of learning or during teaching, whatever format that is, whether it's face-to-face or online. In fact, I will tell you, online really has some interesting tools that you can use for formative evaluation that Alicia will share. The summative evaluation just happens at the end. So they are both important and both part of the process. One does not replace the other, and you can't do one without the other. So those are just some things to consider as you're kind of moving through. So the question comes for us, how should we decide on what test questions to use and what we can use? So you're going to get this slide again because I always use this. But one of the things that that drives everything that we do starts with goals and objectives that we establish. That becomes basically the cornerstone of everything that we do in the driving force, if you will. So we start with our overall program level goals, and every one of your programs, every one of your disciplines has program level goals and objectives somewhere along the way. Sometimes they are from external or outside sources. In other words, you're using things. Sometimes they are specific to your offering. To what kind of program of study our students are taking. You have a program set of goals and objectives that when they graduate from our degrees, whether it's undergraduate, graduate level master's programs, or doctoral level programs, that there's a set of goals and objectives, knowledge and skills and abilities that students leave with. So we establish those first up. From there, we break down into course level objectives. In other words, each one of your courses has a certain level of objectives or goals that we want to accomplish that realign with the overall program goals. And we also have behavioral objectives that we use that get a little bit more specific to each one of our lessons that we offer. So if you're teaching a 15-week course or you're teaching an 8-week graduate course or whatever you're teaching, we break down those objectives and the things that we want to accomplish in our course into individual lessons. And those get very, very specific sometimes. Now, from those behavioral objectives, we do two things. We can establish instructional strategies and the things that we wish to accomplish or the ways that we wish to accomplish those behavioral objectives. And a lot of times, the behavioral objective will automatically tell you what type of teaching you need to do. So if we have a student that's going to have to demonstrate a certain skill, we obviously know that we have to demonstrate that skill. We have to let them practice with the skill. We have to go around and watch that they can do the skill. That's how we teach that. So those are just some things that guide that. And then we have assessments. That's both what we said before, formative and summative assessment. And those assessments are again driven by the behavioral objectives. So in essence, when we establish our behavioral objectives, we can also write our assessments. Even before we've even taught the course, we know how we're going to assess it because those behavioral objectives, those lesson plan objectives, if you would, are the driving force to not only teaching, but also to assessing. And once we have assessed our students, then that assessment tells us, did we meet our behavioral objectives and ultimately course level objectives and program level objectives. Let's take a look at an example because I talk about this, but what does this mean? Let's take an overall program level goal, and this is just an example. I know this is a little smaller to see, but let's just simply say the overall program level goal is participants will be able to apply instructional technology principles. That's a course that I teach and where students would be able to do it. Now, it's a very, very broad objective, and you say, well, I'm not sure how to measure that because it is very, very broad. So maybe now we break this down into a course level objective, and I pick something that would fit. And within one of the courses I teach, there are several objectives that will meet that first applied instructional technology principle. So let's take a course level objective, such as students will be able to integrate learning management systems-based learning activities. In other words, they're going to be able to teach online. Okay, pretty decent objective. Little broad still, but it is written for the student. It does whatever. So now we break this down, and let's take a look at the TSWBAT. Thus, student will be able to develop, create, and facilitate a relevant discussion board given a Blackboard shell and topic area of their choosing. Another objective might be that the student will be able to define LMS. They will be able to define discussion board and list purposes. Okay, so these now become a couple of different objectives that I might incorporate within a lesson that I would teach. Okay, very good. So that's these objectives, that behavioral objectives, a little more finite, a little more focused, and kind of funnel down a bit. But you can see how the behavioral objectives, in essence, relate back to the program level goals and the course level goals. So now that tells me, how can I go about teaching that? Well, obviously, I have to do a little bit of lecture and a little bit of discussion about what these things are. In other words, what is a discussion board? I can talk about what an LMS is. You know, LMSs are Blackboard, it's Canvas, it's this, it's that. I can go through and show all the different things. I can show the students and demo how to set up a discussion board in Blackboard. In other words, how to set the links up, how to establish that, and those are the technical things. Simple, but they need to see it. And then what I probably do is set up an activity that will facilitate the students setting up their own discussion board in a shell and maybe facilitating with other students. In other words, teaching them how to teach a discussion board or utilize something like that. And then what I can do is figure out a way to assess that. So maybe there are several different things in order to assess whether I met this goal, this objective up under the behavioral objectives. Maybe I have the students develop and facilitate a discussion board in their own shell. So what I do is I establish a kind of a lab shell, if you will, where students are in there, not just as students, they're in there as faculty members, which means they can go in and manipulate and do things, and they can set things up and work. And so I have them work with each other in their own shell, kind of as like a mock teaching kind of thing, where the students then are able to facilitate their own discussion board. And so what I would need to do is establish and set up a rubric on their final discussion board, the setup, development, the facilitation, and then I would grade them based upon preset criteria. And that's criteria that I would share with them. That's what Nicole had gone through a couple of weeks ago. In order to test the concepts and the idea of their ability to define an LMS or define discussion board or list the purposes, now maybe I have to write exam questions for that. And maybe I give them a test. Okay, doesn't mean I will, but this is one of the ways that I could assess whether they know those objectives. So maybe I write multiple choice questions that list a bunch of different definitions and they pick the right one. Okay, maybe I have them, maybe I just write a short answer question that says, please list the purposes of a discussion board, and I have preset answers of what I'm looking for. So this is a way that we can now look at how we break this down from an overall program level goal all the way down to course level behavioral objectives, the strategies, and the assessments. And this now kind of shows a little bit of an example. Questions about this? Okay, pretty straightforward, I think. All right, let's talk a little bit about the type of exams that are out there. Many of us tap into publishers' material, okay? Publishers' material, if I had to ask, what's the value of utilizing publishers' material? In other words, we utilize books for most of our classes. And many of the publishers have provided a lot of publishers' type of material or teacher support material. Sometimes it's case studies or it's PowerPoint slides that go along with chapters and a bunch of things like that. But also a lot of times you will find that they have publisher developed tests and exams. What's the value of that? Any idea? What's the value of those kind of things?
Consistency of the content. So the wording and the structure is similar to what is in the chapter. it's like easy for the student to identify where to go to find the answer.
True. I absolutely agree with that. What else is of value for the publishers type exams? One of the things that I have seen is the fact that the publishers exams are very valid. In other words, they have gone through a fairly rigorous process. They have, quote, experts that have written the book and people that know how to do and develop tests. They will develop the tests and they write them and they're valid and they're reliable and they've been vetted very heavily. And that's good. But what's the downside of publisher's material or a publisher's exam? Any idea?
I would assume they can be retrieved electronically and students can do very well.
Yeah, I've had that happen where they.
Yeah, test security can become an issue. Yeah. Yeah, as Jess is saying, we've all seen this. So that is something that we need to be watchful of, as well as test security. And that's not part of what we're going to talk about today, is just the whole idea of test security and cheating. But that is a concern, is them having access to that material, because it is out there. Even though it's generally coded by the publisher and you have to access, students can still access certain things like that. So that's a concern as well. The bigger thing for me, though, if I'm using a test that somebody else has written, the question is that a test that perfectly aligns with my behavioral objectives and what I've taught? And it may or may not. So, that's somewhat problematic. So the question then comes, is there value in a teacher-made test? In other words, where you design the test questions yourself. And I would argue there is value in that. Okay, there is extreme value in that, because then you can be assured that you're testing the objectives that you taught. We utilize publishers' material. We utilize books and things of that nature to augment what we're doing, but they don't always align with exactly what we're teaching and the focus that we wish to have for our students. And that's based upon a lot of different things. It's based upon our program needs that may or may not align with a book perfectly. And I've rarely found textbooks that align perfectly with everything that I want to teach. So there's that part of it. The downside of a teacher-made test is the fact that it doesn't go through the rigorous validity and reliability processes that a publisher's exam may go through. So there's this balance that you have. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll take a publisher's exam and pull from that and utilize certain questions from within there when I've done this and augment that alongside my own questions that I'll write. But they have to go through a process. So the question comes, where should test questions emanate? In other words, where should they come from? They should be heavily vetted as a combination, if you will. If you have publisher's material, use them if it aligns and pull from that as you need to. If a publisher's test fully aligns with what you're looking to test, great, use it. But that's not a one-size-fits-all. I would tell you that any test question goes back to that previous slide where it emanates from your behavioral objectives and aligns with your course and your program level objectives. If they don't, then you're going to have problems because you're really not measuring what you think you're measuring. So there's different types of teacher-made tests and exams that you're going to see, and even some of the publisher's material utilize this. There's multiple choice questions and what we call the compound multiple choice, or the multiple multiple choice questions, where you get 1 and 2, 2 and 3, and it's those kind of things. You can have true and false, and some people say, well, true and false is just a 50-50 toss-up guess. Well, there's some value in utilizing true and false, and there's ways to make that reliable and valid. There's matching, there's fill in the blank, there's short answer, which is kind of a list and describe kind of a thing. List the 5 steps, list the 5 purposes, list 3, whatever. And then you can have essays. And we're going to talk a little bit about utilizing each of those and assessing or grading each one of those. So creating test questions and items may seem easy on the surface, but I will tell you a lot of thought must go into test creation to make it effective, but also to make it valid and reliable. Many times teachers test things they never meant to assess. And if you're asking a question, let me give you an example. A math teacher might have a question worded in such a way that the student's really not just, the teacher's not able to just assess their math knowledge or their math skill, if you will, but their ability to read a test. So it becomes more language art skills than it is actually math skills that are tested. So you have to be careful to make sure that you're testing what you think you're testing. And that's validity. The reliability factor is based upon a consistency of a person's score, or the consistency of two different people assessing or looking at an assessment and coming up with the same score. 2 weeks, we're going to go through and talk about reliability and validity of testing, how we do item analysis, how we go through and really vet out an exam and really take a look at, item discrimination, item analysis, and take a look at just basically assessing our assessment. And is it valid and reliable? And that's not always an easy process, which is why a lot of faculty will shy away from using this and just automatically go to a publisher's material. But again, the publisher's material may or may not align with what we've taught. And so then again, we're testing things. One of the things I'm going to say, and it's not on any of the slides or any of the material I have, but one of the things I'm going to tell you is this: do not open the book to a specific chapter and plunk your finger down and say, ooh, there's a concept, and now make a question out of it. I've seen teachers do that over the years, and they say, well, students are responsible for everything's in the book. Well, maybe they are, maybe they're not. But if you test something obscure like that, an obscure line in a book, and make them responsible, they may not know that, just simply because that's not been a focus of what you're teaching is. So it has to be based upon your objectives. Okay, that's number one in my mind. And you want to make your tests fair. So let's talk a little bit about multiple choice questions, which are the most popular, as they can test a large amount of content. Okay, and that's why most teachers use them. Most faculty will use them. They're just a good thing. They consist of a STEM, a correct answer, and a series of distractors, which are designed to be plausible enough that a student who doesn't know the material very well may move to that answer over the right answer. So we're testing their knowledge of certain things. Okay? Test items should measure the required skill or the information that we're having that we want to test. And again, based off the objectives, it should focus on important, not trivial or subject area content. That goes back to the line where you open the textbook and find an obscure line in there. You want more important information, the things that you felt were important enough to establish within your objectives. Those are the focus of things that you should establish within your testing. It needs to contain accurate information. Okay, if you put misinformation in there in your STEM or in the right answer, then it's going to be distracting to the student. And again, you're not testing their knowledge, you're testing their ability to survive your test. And that's not always a good thing either. That's why a lot of people get, quote, test anxiety, is because a lot of times they've been bumped up against a poor test that really doesn't test what they know. And when you query the student after they missed a question, but they know the material. So was that question valid? And those are the things that we want to know. Was that test fair? Include things like correct spelling. If you misspell a word, what's the student doing? They're focused on that misspelled word, and that misspelled word may have misinformation or may direct them in a different direction. You don't know how they're thinking, so you have to be careful with that. You need to make sure it's written at an appropriate level of difficulty. In other words, you don't want to be too easy, you don't want it to be too difficult, and the only one that truly knows that is you. Is it written at the appropriate level? You want to be clear and concise. You're not trying to trick students. You're trying to assess what they know. And in essence, if you really think about it, we want our students to get it all right, because that's what we've taught and that's been our goal. Doesn't mean everybody will, but that's our goal, is to have all of our students walk away with a certain body of knowledge and skill. We want them to be bias-free. We don't want them to focus on extraneous things. We want them to focus on the content that we've taught, and you want to be careful about those things. In other words, that opinions aren't put in there, because that can be distracting. The STEM of each question should provide sufficient information. It should avoid extra information, should be grammatically correct, avoid clues that help give away answers, and avoid negatives or absolutes. A lot of times people will put in all of the following are correct, or none of the following are correct, except. be careful of those things. They can be confusing for students. You ever take a multiple choice question where you weren't really sure what they were asking? Are they asking for the positive aspect of that or the negative aspect? And it gets confusing. Okay. There's things like the following is not. Okay. And then as you're reading it, you start to talk yourself into, well, they're looking for the positive, they're looking for the negative, and you get confused in what you're supposed to answer. Avoid second person writing, such things as you. Okay. Stay within the third person pronouns, she, he, him, her, etc. Okay. Utilizing you can be a little confusing in the wording for students, and they can misinterpret what it is that you're looking for. Responses for each question should provide only one correct answer. And sometimes in an item analysis at the end, we find out that, well, there was probably more than one correct answer. So that becomes confusing for the students, and they're going to spend extra time on that trying to decide which answer you're really looking for. And that may distract them from doing well on the rest of the exam. It should avoid things like all or none of the above. That in many cases, an instructor says, well, I can't come up with enough distractors, so I'm going to stick an all or none of the above in there. In my mind, if you can't come up with enough distractors and you have to go to an all or none of the above, it probably is not a good question. Okay. I'm not saying that you can't use these occasionally, but don't overuse them as a filler for a distractor. Incorrect answers called distractors should not be obvious. Keep them simple if you would, but keep them focused on what your information is. And they shouldn't be too obvious. Distractors should point out errors in thinking along the levels of Bloom's taxonomy, which looks at higher and lower order thinking skills. And that's where you're testing. When you talk about Bloom's taxonomy, there is information up on our Blackboard shell about Bloom's. And if you've got questions about that, I'll be glad to sit and talk with anybody about, utilizing Bloom's taxonomy. But we've had a number of times done presentations on behavioral objective writing and the use of Bloom's. It should provide, again, only one correct answer. That becomes a key. It should avoid, that's double clicked in there. All right, my apologies. Test construction should avoid similar answers. In other words, a test question, such as question number 2, should not provide an answer for question 23, for example. Or maybe they, if you're answering questions, you go, I'm not sure what that is. But then all of a sudden, you're reading ahead and you get to question number 15. You go, ooh, there's the answer for question number 2. So you haven't tested whether the student knows or understands that piece of concept. They have gotten the answer correct because you gave them the answer and they were just able to kind of match those things up. So you need to be careful about that as well. So let's go through, and I'm going to share something with you. And I have this on a Blackboard shell. I also, if you go into the invitation today to this session, there is a link. I have this up on Google as well, and you've all been given access to it. This is about a 15-page document that is posted up on the Blackboard shell, and I will post this video up next to it under our outcomes assessment. And it's some test writing tips that will help you as you are going through and writing your own exams. So let's kind of go through. This information is what I just went through. Test construction, all of that information. That's all there for you because I didn't provide the rest. But this is up as a Word document on our Blackboard shell and is up on Google for all of you to utilize as you decide to write your own. So let's go through the 10 tips and see what we can come up with. Tip 1, the extent to which students engage in deep or surface learning is tied directly to their perceptions of what they will be tested on. So think about this. Everybody is focused. In the first day, in fact, when you open up your classes, what's one of the first things that students do? They want to see the syllabus. They want to know how they're going to be assessed. What is it? Are you going to give tests and exams and quizzes? And if you do, they want to know when and how you're going to test, because there's all kinds of anxiety associated with that because everybody wants an A. Okay. But what does an A represent? We could spend a whole hour talking about what grades represent and all of that. And that's where grades comes from, is our assessments, whether it's a project, it's a paper, it's presentations, it's an exam. It all comes from that. So that's what they're focused on, is showing what they've learned. So the first set of tests that you give set the tone or the expectation for the students, that they kind of figure what and how you're going to assess. And I would probably tell you, the earlier in the semester, the better. And if you are going to test, more is better. Okay. In other words, I will be honest with you, a lot of the courses that I teach at this point in my teaching career, I do not test. I do projects, because that's what we do in those courses. But if I were teaching certain courses that had a number of different concepts, or I was teaching certain skills, then I would provide tests and have in classes that I've used in the past. It's not a matter of what you like or don't like. It's what is the best tool to measure the students' learning, or the outcomes, if you will. So I would tell you, if you are providing tests and quizzes, don't wait till the end and say, well, here's a big, massive multiple choice question, because now the students don't understand how you test. They don't understand what they need to do. It becomes part of that teaching and learning process. Tip number 2, test length is crucial to the reliability of a test. Now, let's go back. What's the difference? What's validity and what's reliability? Validity is very simply, does a test measure what it is supposed to measure, or is it testing something else? Any assessment needs to be valid, and there's lots of different ways to make something valid. Reliability is the consistency of scores. In other words, if a student takes your test today and they take the same test a week from now, they should be scoring very similarly on that. If not, then there's another factor that was in play, and you weren't really testing what you thought you were, and it's just not consistent of a score. So the test really doesn't have any value. You want to make sure that your outcomes assessment has value, that you can say this test or this assessment assessed the objectives, and I know whether my students learned or not. That becomes the key to what you're looking for. So time is a key factor here. If you've got, basically most of us have 50 minutes. If you really think about it, if you're giving an exam in a class, if you're giving, if you're teaching a class, 2 times a week or 3 times a week, you may have anywhere from an hour's worth of class, which is really 50 minutes, to maybe an hour and a half, which is about 75 minutes, given the fact that, we work off a 50-minute hour. So you have to be cognizant of the amount of time that you have for your students. So just packing in, say, well, I'll give you 100 questions in 50 minutes. Well, it depends upon the type of question, whether that is doable or it's not. Some general rules to be asked. True or false, can be about 30 seconds a piece. Multiple choice is generally 1 minute a piece. So if you got a 50-minute class, you don't want to go much more than 50 multiple choice questions or 100 multiple choice questions. You have to kind of be aware of how much the average person is going to be able to get through. Completion, 1 minute short answer, 2 minutes multiple choice. With the higher level thinking, that's the multiple choice, where you give them a STEM and then you give them maybe 3 or 4 answers, and then the responses are A and B, B and C, B and D, all of the above, none of the above, some of the above, 2 of the above, 3 of the above, whatever. And then that's something that may take a little bit longer, because now you're testing multiple concepts. And that's one of the value in utilizing a multiple choice test. You can test lots of different things. Short answers depends on how big they are, but the general rule, maybe 10 to 15 minutes. An extended essay. How many of you remember going through undergraduate where you were given a blue book, and in an hour's time, you were given 3 questions to answer, and you were lucky if you could get through the blue book? And I remember exams that I had where you just filled blue books, and sometimes it was 2 blue books, depending upon the test. That's something that you need to take into consideration. Some other things: the number of items for a 50-minute test, 40 to 45 multiple choice items, 60 to 80 true or false. These are general numbers to consider. And I think it's dependent upon the question, depends upon the content, depends upon the amount of time. And sometimes you need to take the test, or need to pilot it, or get one of your colleagues to look at your test to take it. How long is it going to take these people to answer these questions, and what is reasonable? Okay, those are all things that you need to take into consideration. And you also have to look at the fastest student will typically finish a test about half the time as the slowest student. And you've got all those different things, people's different reading factors. Tip number 3, develop tests that have a high level of reliability and validity. And that's one of the reasons that people will use or gravitate toward publishers' materials, because we know that they're professionally written. But that doesn't always mean for us that they are reliable or valid, because we may not have taught that information. Factors that influence reliability, which is basically consistency of scores, the length of the test, the time limits of the test, the nature of the student group, the common set of instructions that you give, and those are also key. Your instructions need to have a certain level of clarity to them. The common environment that you're giving, the scoring procedure for the test, in other words, how you go about scoring that, especially things like essay exams, short answer exams. In other words, they're going to be a little different. If you're having a multiple choice test or a true false, there's one right answer. And it's a real easy thing. You either put it through Scantron, or if you're grading it through Blackboard, it just automatically grades. But the short answer and the essay take a little bit more time on your part. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Test reliability can be improved with relative ease. Tests should be long enough to sample the content well. Doesn't mean you have to assess everything, but you want to make sure that you get enough of it that you know, do the students know this material? The time limit should allow most students to finish. The score range should be wide. Items at mid-level difficulty range. We'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks about looking at item analysis. That fourth one, items should be free of ambiguity and tricks. You don't want to trick your students, because that's not testing what they know or what they can do. It's testing whether they picked up on your trick or not. And that's not always a good thing, because, those things, how many times have you sat there reading someone's test question to realize that it's ambiguous, and depending upon how you read it, it could be answer A or it could be answer C. And you're going to spend a significant amount of time trying to figure out what's the instructor really trying to get, and am I going to be able to guess correctly or not? And that's not a good thing either. Essay tests, the biggest issue is consistency of readers across lines. And one of the things that I'll share as a story, we do some writing assessment, and I usually have 3 to 4 readers read a writing sample, and we use it for admissions criteria. And we've done a lot of things to kind of get consistency. But I'll tell you what, I get 4 readers on one writing sample. I'll get a 4, a 3, a 2, and a 1 from 4 different evaluators on the same sample. So is that a reliable thing? It is absolutely not. So I have no idea what that real score is based upon those things, because even though they're using a rubric or a checklist, they're looking at 4 different things. So you need to get some consistency within there. So developing a prescribed scoring method, this rubric or checklist, is important. And there's a process that goes through on how you can best make that happen as well. You want to look for point values, written responses through each question by the instructor that is reviewed before reading the student answer. So you need to know what you're looking for. And some tips to get through to be more reliable. If you've got multiple questions, in other words, essays, maybe you just give an essay test where you have 3 essay questions, grade all the answers to one question across the test. That will keep you more consistent in what you are evaluating. You also have to be very, very careful that as you are doing that, in other words, when you read the first one and you read the last one, are you still using the same criteria to grade, or has your mind shifted somewhere along the lines? A lot of times what I end up doing is I grade, the first one, and by the time I get to the last one, I realize in my head, maybe I've shifted my criteria a little bit. Even though I'm using a rubric tool, it doesn't mean, that we're always consistent in what we're doing. So you need to be aware of that. Factors that affect validity, which is, does a test measure what it's supposed to measure? Things like, are the directions clear? Does the test require inappropriate levels of skill that were not part of the course? In other words, are you testing things that you didn't teach? Test items are poorly written, and that happens from time to time. what we sit down and write ourselves and think, oh, that's perfectly clear. And then when the students get a hold of it and after the test, bring it to us, you go, oh, okay, I see what you mean. That wasn't my intention, but I can see why it wasn't clear for you. The test length, we talked about that. Complexity and subjectivity of scoring. In other words, you want to make things as objective as you possibly can. In other words, are we basing our assessment on the objectives, or are we basing it on something else? If the scoring process has many steps, that becomes more opportunities for us to make mistakes as the evaluator. To improve validity, I would tell you the first thing to do is have someone else read your test. In other words, have one of your colleagues who knows the content that you're teaching and understands test writing, take a look at that. Is there clarity in both your questions and your directions and what you're using? I would tell you use a test matrix to check the balance of questions in relationship to what was taught. In other words, are these aligning back to your objectives? And you can look at that. And if you can't find, in other words, if you have a test question and you can't find an objective or a place where you taught that, then it's probably not a good question. And that may be something that you're using as an obscure line out of a or out of a book someplace or some concept. Be careful of that. That's not what you're looking to do. I would tell you, develop test questions the day you teach the material. And that goes back to what I said before. You can write your test questions before you even teach the material so that you know what you are testing and you know what you're teaching, because those things align and they are perfectly matched. Ask enough questions to adequately cover the material that was taught, but don't try and trick students up, because you're not trying to do it. In all honesty, we want students to get A's because that's what we do. We are teaching the material and we want students to absorb what we're doing, to gain the knowledge and skills. So don't trick them up, because that's not the key. So let's talk a little bit more about writing multiple choice questions. First, as I said before, you need a quality STEM, which is just basically the root question, if you would. Quality STEM is one in which the students are able to read the STEM, and they basically, once they've read your STEM, have an understanding of what should follow. In other words, what the correct answer is right then and there. A STEM may be an incomplete sentence. Sometimes it may be a complete sentence. Pick the one that has such. Okay, you can do those things. It should be written in its simplest form, consistent with precision and clarity. That becomes the key. Do not pad the STEM with superficial or superfluous material. That only adds confusion, only adds time to the student. You don't want to do that. State if you want the students to find the correct answer or the best answer. Remember that? The best answer, I would sit there and I would beat my head and, oh, what's best? Well, this is better than this is. Make those things clear. If you're asking that, don't make two equal things that they have to have value judgment that may or may not align with yours. You want things to be clear in what you're doing. In writing distractors, and this becomes the key to writing a good question. You can write a STEM and a correct answer and you go, this is perfect, this aligns, I know exactly. But now, in order to make this test question good, that again, the student will be able to pick the correct answer, your distractors are of key importance. So number one, write distractors that are plausible enough to attract students that don't know the material well. Now, maybe there's something slightly off, and that a student that didn't study or doesn't know the material might gravitate toward that answer. If you can't develop, and this is key, if you can't develop a sufficient number of plausible distractor answers, then don't use the question. And don't backfill that with all of the above or none of the above. That's just, it's a lazy thing in my mind, and you're just, taking the shortcut. If you can't come up with enough plausible answers or enough distractors, don't use the question, okay? Or you could reword that, I would say, if you've got something you still want to test, make it a true or false question. Some of those scattered in don't hurt, okay? I would tell you sometimes, and I've seen instructors do this, using humor in the answers usually gives away the answer, and therefore it's not of value. So a question like the founder of Ferris State University was A. Ferris Bueller, Ferris Wheel, or Woodbridge Ferris. Okay, it's obvious, and I don't even have any idea who the founder of Ferris State University is, but I can tell you the answer here. It's C. Some of you thought that it was A. It's not. Ferris Bueller is not correct. But that's one of those things that it's obvious, and in all honesty, this question has no validity to it. Okay, there's no value to this because you gave the student the answer. So I didn't test what I thought I was testing. And that's just a distractor. I've heard faculty say, well, I put in a joke in there just to give them a mental break. You don't want to do that because that distracts their focus. For the 50 minutes that you're giving them an exam, that's what you want them focused on, is the content, the material, not humor. Okay, that doesn't do any good. You want to also make the distractors fairly homogeneous. In other words, if you have the answer at a certain length, you don't want the distractors longer or shorter. You want them of consistent length in what you're doing, consistent wording, and so that, again, the distractor pulls the student who doesn't know the material as well, and the student who does know the material will be able to gravitate and obviously see the correct answer. Those are key things that you want to. Avoid giving irrelevant clues to the students. You want to measure their content and cognitive abilities, not their test-taking skills. How many people do you know that have said, I never study for a multiple choice test, I can figure them out? Well, that's because they're reading the question and able, just the way questions are written, to find the correct answer. And that's where test writing becomes, more art than science, if you will. There's a lot to this, which is why a lot of faculty, when they start getting into this, realize, this is more difficult than I thought it was. And students who walk away going, yeah, I got an A in the course and I got an A on the test, but don't ask me what I really know. And that's why a lot of faculty will go back to fill a blue book. Tell me everything that you know about X. And maybe that's a better way. I don't know. But I think there's a value in learning how to write tests. And there are people that do that for a living. But there are ways that we as faculty can do that. It takes time. And I will be straight up with you. It does take time to do it and to do it right. And it's not a one and done. It is one of those things, you write a test, you give it, you go through item analysis, item and distractors, you get other people to look at it, you get student feedback on it, and maybe it's something that takes a couple of terms to get correct. Just the way things are. Example of irrelevant clues, length clues. Longest answer is often the correct answer. Be careful of those kind of things. That's how students look. Verbal association, using a word in the stem that also appears in the answers. Don't do that, because now all they're doing, that's the test reading. Don't give grammatical clues where the stem aligns with one answer but doesn't align with the others perfectly. Be careful of those kind of things. An example of this, the coefficient of correlation. Social studies test is called a valued coefficient. The answer's right there. Equivalent coefficient, index of reliability. Specific stems, these are modifying words or phrases that limit the meaning of the sentences. So be careful of those kind of things. All, never, always are generally associated with incorrect answers in students' minds. Usually, typically, maybe, sometimes, these are associated with correct answers. Okay? Be careful of those kind of things. Those are clues. Watch your positives and your negatives. Use positive statements where you can. Negative statements can be confusing to students. I can remember sitting there for great periods of time, and those would be questions I would skip and then try and come back to, and then at the end just rack my brain, what is it that they're saying? And the more you read it, the more you've talked yourself into the wrong direction, positive or negative, what they're doing. I just tell you, avoid that. Avoid all of the above, none of the above, for some of the reasons that we've talked about. There's more here. Additional considerations, some things to think about. Item independence, giving the correct answer. I mentioned that before because this is one that I've seen time and time again in tests, even tests that I've done and thought I had vetted out well. I will use my own test banks and adjust things and but I find that I'm giving the correct answer from one question to another, and that's not what I want to do. That's not easily picked up as well. Avoid letting one answer, I said that. Arrange the options in a logical order, alpha order, or if numbers in ascending order. Be careful of those things. Correct response choice, A, B, C, or D, should be equally divided. In other words, be careful of providing all A's as answers, or all B's as answers, or C. What was it? It was always when I was in college, it was always choose C. C is all, C is, if when in doubt, choose C. It's C's more often the answer. That's not true. Depends upon how the instructor lays things out and what they do, but just be careful that you're not providing all B's as your correct answer. Students will figure that out within the first 5 or 6 questions. Avoid lifting stems verbatim from text in a book. Avoid lifting anything verbatim from text in a book. This encourages students to rather to memorize, and they will understand that that's how you're testing after your first test. You want to have the answers arranged in vertical columns. This makes it easier to read as opposed to just, A, B, C in a line. Keep them. It's a visual thing for the student to be able to see it a little bit easier. Some checklists. Make sure that the item measures significant concepts and principles. Do not write items covering trivial content. In other words, go back to your objectives. Your objectives did not establish trivial content because you didn't want to waste your time writing them that way. So don't test them that way either. The STEM should present a problem, thus a verb is absolutely necessary here. State the item clearly and concisely using only relevant material. Again, goes back to the objective. Include as much of the item material in the STEM, but do not repeat words or phrases in each distractor that could be put in the STEM and could either confuse the student as to what the right answer or the wrong answer may be. Write one correct or clearly best answer and 3 or 4 very plausible distractors that will align with them in the way that they are written so that they're not obviously not the answer. And that again goes back to validity or the reliability of what the students are asking. Avoid giving clues to the right answer in other questions or in a particular question. Some common clues are grammatical things, length of the options, and some specific determiners that you would use. In other words, they're key clues that you're putting in your question, either in the distractors, in the correct answer, or in the STEM itself. Those are things. True and false. True and false questions, a lot of teachers will shy away from those because you go, well, it's a coin flip. Okay, so how valid is that? Well, in order to make them more valid, you put more questions in. In other words, you can give a true and false test, and what did we say before? True and false, 30 seconds is generally the accepted rule. So in a 50-minute test, maybe you can give 90 of those, and that will assume a certain level of reliability. I have a better way, personally. I'll smatter some true and false in throughout that test certain concepts, and you can word them and such. That they can test multiple concepts of true and false, which answer is true, and you're testing multiple understandings of concepts. They can be very, very positive, but I don't know that I'm not an all or nothing kind of person. I don't think all multiple choice by themselves are necessarily good. I don't think all true and false. I think if you can incorporate multiple things into a test, I think you're testing better, and you have a better cross section. Negatives of true and false can be difficult to write without giving things away. Writing true or false statements that have no exceptions is problematic. Guessing on part of the students, that's a 50-50 coin toss. That's always an issue. And students can also make an educated guess, and they feel more comfortable in going yes or no, true or false, simply because they can do that. And there are some other things in here, and I don't want to waste time on that. These are all here for you to kind of assess. A poorly written one. In his studies of AIDS, Dr. White found that many of those who contracted the HIV virus were exposed through the use of drug needles that had been used by an infected person. It's poorly written because there's so much in there, a student not really sure what you're saying. Better version, in his studies of AIDS, Dr. White found that many, over 20%, blank, blah, blah, infected person. So it's a more direct kind of a statement, and that's the key. If you're getting real wordy, students are going to get lost in your words. And again, you're not testing what you think you're testing their ability to understand what you're trying to say. Keep your writing simple, keep it clear. And a lot of times I will tell you, students will mistest answers, not because they did or didn't know the material or the answer, but just simply because they're not sure what you were asking for based upon your writing, your grammar, your sentence structure, those kind of things. So those are all factors to consider as you're going through. Use of compound sentences can be used by stating a condition first and then followed by an explanation. An example here, because the combustion of gasoline creates gases that pollute the air. Cars produce more pollutants at 50 miles per hour than at 35. You have to look at the different factors that go into what you're doing. There is what we call the problem-solving approach. Last night, John bought a used car. This morning, it would not start. John begins to search the possible causes of the car's failure to start. Decide whether each statement is or is not a plausible reason for the car starting. The carburetor may be malfunctioning. The exhaust manifold may be loose. The battery may be discharged. The car may be out of gas. They're now looking at thinking through these processes of what would. Now, I'm not a car guy, so I can't tell you which answers here are correct, but you start to understand that now I'm testing multiple concepts here in one. And this could be a multiple choice where you figure, okay, 1 and 3 are true, and you maybe just simply say, pick the true statement. So this is one of those examples of a multiple choice type question. You're testing multiple concepts here in one question, and that's easily done. Another example, the Boston Tea Party, 1773, was actually carried out by the Indians, planned as a revolt against taxes, done because the tea market in America was overstocked and prices were falling. And maybe I just simply say which of the following are true. Okay, that now becomes a compound multiple choice question. Again, I'm testing multiple concepts. So you could say 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 1, 2 and 3, 2 and 3, all of the above, none of the above, some of the above, whatever, however you want to word that. Short answers and written. There's lots of things that you can do with these, and we're going to spend a significant amount of time talking about. You can write wonderful essay questions. But in doing so, and you can even write short answers or completion items, and you put down the answer that you're looking for. A lot of times, these will require you to develop a rubric, and there's lots of examples here of what we can do. But in doing these kind of things, short answers and written answers, you need to develop a rubric of what you're looking for and establish the correct answer or key points that you want students to bring forward, and make sure that those are key points that are taught in the things that you're grading. Essay type exams, short answer, long answers, provide a lot of different material that you're going to cover, but you want to make sure that you're assessing the concepts and not students' writing ability. In other words, maybe you have students that really write well and you're reading that, this is a wonderful answer, and a student who doesn't write so well, but they have all the concepts. So what are you testing? What are you assessing? Are you assessing their writing ability? If you're an English teacher, maybe that's part of what you're doing. If you are not, you're looking to understand what they know, what they learned, and what they're able to articulate. Okay, those are the things. So be careful with that. You can talk about matching items and how you can establish those. There's a whole set of rules in here on how to utilize those. Rules on writing essay tests. There's some advantages here in how you do this, and there's some serious limitations to this, and that's part of that scoring process that we'll talk about next week when we go through this. The reliability concerns are what I talked about before with the individual faculty. In other words, if Ann and I were looking at something and we added Carl into this, we may come up with 3 different scores. So when we want to come up with a consistency of structure and developing a rubric and making sure that we are assessing what we think we are assessing and not other things. Okay. There's a lot of material in here that will help you to write exams, and there's some examples of some things on scoring, some grading procedures. You can read. If you ever given an essay test or short answer, you can find very clearly when a student is bluffing that they don't know the answer. And there's some keys, things in here to look at. Things that I would tell you: test on a regular basis. If you are going to test, if you have certain concepts of things that you want to test or you're going to test through your course, testing more is better. And I said that toward the beginning. Don't just wait and give, a midterm exam and a final exam. I'd throw some quizzes in there, and it will help the students to understand what and how they need to learn and how they need to study. Tip number 10, the feedback of test results is crucial to student learning. Okay. This is the key. I have seen this, and one of the things that I would tell you, if you are testing, build in time to review the test into your teaching, because there is an awful lot to learn from testing and what students have tested or what they have learned in testing. How many times have you gotten back tests in your career where you looked at this, simply the score, and said, hey, I got an A, I got a B, I got this, I got that, but you never go through the test to find out, to solidify what you learned and what you didn't know? And I think there's value in that. So I think feedback of test results is of high importance, but I think sometimes we as faculty, because of our time crunches, don't spend as much time on that, assisting students to figure out what they've learned and to figure out what they didn't learn and what they need to know. I think that's a wrong approach to teaching and learning. I think there is value in the feedback of tests. It can give students a lot of very, very solid feedback and on construction of what they know. I think faculty need to do post-test analysis, and like I said, we're going to talk about that at greater length next week, or 2 weeks from today, actually. But you can do some real basic statistics that will tell you about your test. You can do percentage scores. You can do mean, median, and mode. The mean is just the average score. The median, sometimes those who are statisticians will tell you the median score is probably a better indication of central tendency of how the class did overall. Those can be consistent with the mean, but sometimes the median is a little more accurate to what's going on. You can do the mode. I'm not really sure what the mode ever tells you, except, 10 students scored 96%. Okay, what do I know? Well, I know 10 students scored a 96%. Although it can be an indication that I may take a look at those tests and go, wait a minute, these answers are the same. And I think maybe some students may have collaborated some way. And those are things. The thing that we will talk about at greater length here in 2 weeks is the ability to do what we call an item analysis. And also something else where we do item discrimination. And that's where I will take a look at a multiple choice test and now break it down, not only to find out how many students got question 1 right or wrong, but what answers they answered and how you are able to know, was a certain distractor a good distractor or was it not? In other words, it's not just a face validity. Take a look at it and go, hey, that looks pretty good. But what did the students answer? In other words, if you break this down and you look and say, well, nobody answered A and nobody answered D, so were those of value to you or not? So we'll talk a little bit more about those in the coming weeks and months. So with that, we are kind of a little bit over the hour that I kind of anticipated for this, but does anybody have any questions? One of the things that I would challenge you to do is, had we had more time, I would have asked you to take the objectives that you have for your courses and for any lessons that you have, develop some questions out of each. And I will offer this to you. If you want to share those with me or any of the instructional designers, we will be glad to work with you and kind of give you some feedback on some questions. And, we're not experts we're not subject matter experts in your field. We're in our own fields, but we can give you some feedback on, just looking at some test things. And that test document that I told you was there. Sorry. The test tips writing is attached to this invite, but it's also up on our Blackboard shell. Everybody should be part of that. If you are not finding the CIT Blackboard shell in your list, please drop me an email and I will make sure that you get added to that. There is a plethora of information up there, and I think it's fairly well organized. We have a lot of micro videos, we have a lot of material, but there's a section up there on outcomes and the series of seminars that we've been running this fall. We're posting all of these videos, and all of the materials. So this 15-page test writing tips handout is there for you to download, to use. You have access to it on Google. You have access to it on the Blackboard shell as a Word document. So any questions, anything that anybody wants to bring forward that we didn't cover, or things that you have? Hearing none, I thank you all for your time, and I wish you the very, very best. Everybody have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.